Welcome, everybody. We're so happy you're here. This is Housing as a Human Right, a call to action presented by the Pat Brown Institute. We've got a great panel for you. But first, before we start, I wanted to read our land acknowledgement. With great respect, Cal State LA acknowledges the Tongva people as the traditional caretakers of Tovangar, the Tongva world, including the Los Angeles Basin, South Channel Islands, San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys, and portions of Orange, San Bernardino, and Riverside counties. Cal State LA is located within these lands. As an institution located on unceded Tongva land, we pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and our relatives, relations past, present, and emerging. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Cal State LA more accountable to the needs of American Indian peoples. So again, good afternoon. My name is Sasha Brown Rice. I'm the interim executive director at the Pat Brown Institute. And just for those of you who don't know the Institute, before I introduce our moderator and before we jump into the panel, I wanted to just say the Pat Brown Institute is on the campus of Cal State LA, and we were founded by former Governor Pat Brown. And we're dedicated to carrying on his vision and legacy by focusing on inclusive and equitable policy, civic engagement, and convening community stakeholders on vital issues like we're doing today. So I wanted to first introduce our moderator. We're really delighted to have Sarah Dussault. She is a policymaker and advocate, and over the last two decades, her innovative approach to addressing local issues has helped bring real results to the Los Angeles region. She serves as the co-chair on the LA County Blue Ribbon Commission on Homelessness and is working to implement governance and system reform to create accountability. In the past, she also served as vice chair and chair of LAHSA, also known as Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority Commission. And that's the joint city-county agency that coordinates housing and services for homeless individuals and families in the county. She is also, as commission chair in 2019 and 20, Sarah helped to lead the COVID relief efforts, like the project Room Key, as you may remember, to provide emergency housing to more than 8,000 individuals in the county. Sarah also is currently the co-founder and lead on LA for LA, which is a new, really exciting public-private partnership with Mayor Bass to design and unlock new financial tools for immediate housing options. Sarah, we're so delighted to have you here today and really looking forward to jumping into the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much for that warm introduction, and welcome everyone to this session. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the landscape of, the fight against people, the fight against our lack of housing and the service in service of our unhoused neighbors, what's going on right now, what's on the ballot, and sort of lift up a few issues. And then I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel and kind of get into the meat of issues as quickly as I can. So just a little bit of background, homelessness or people experiencing homelessness has increased year over year for some time in the Los Angeles area. And, at the heart of this is our real lack of affordable housing and our lack of subsidies to really keep people in housing. So in order to really take a look at this and kind of how the overall the landscape, the Blue Ribbon Commission, we took a look at the governance structure and really trying to figure out what's the best way to kind of lift up transparency and activate every city within our entire county to really be a part of the solution. And that work, along with a lot of other work that was led by the United Way in terms of the formation of the Regional Housing Authority, which is now called La Casa, those two pieces in combination form the backdrop of what is Measure A, which is on the ballot for LA County on November 5th. And Measure A is a sales tax. It repeals what was called Measure H, which was passed by the voters in 2017. And it replaces it with a 0.5-cent sales tax as opposed to a 1/4 cent. And it attempts to introduce these two issues, which is services in support of people who are experiencing homelessness, but also funding directed specifically at the creation of additional affordable housing throughout LA County. So about 60% of the money is going to go to services, about 40% of the money is going to go towards housing. Sorry, I was just checking the note. And then at that point, that should raise around $1.2 billion a year. The current Measure H raised last year around $600 million. And that is going to be directed at a combination of things. Measure A is incredibly flexible. I see we already have a question, and I think we're going to get to questions towards the end. But if we want to have a break in the middle to bring questions in sooner, that's fine too. And so Measure A is quite flexible. I don't know if, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A function. And that flexibility is intentional so that we can better respond to what is going on at any given moment for people who are experiencing and disproportionately affected by the housing crisis. So the goal is to be able to direct the money at things like prevention, so rental supports. We have data that shows that we could, through rental supports and the preservation of currently existing affordable housing, put $6,000 a year back into people's hands so that they can, pay for all the expenses that they're faced with instead of having to overpay for housing. So those are the kinds of things that are included in Measure A. I do want to make sure that folks have a chance if they want to look at the entire measure. There's several websites. So there's yesona.la. There's measurea.org. I'm also a part of a group called the Angelino Project, and that has a lot of information on angelinoproject.org. So all of that's sort of the general backdrop of what's happening in terms of Measure A. But what this is building on, we hope, is the momentum and the learnings that have happened over the last few years. And specifically because I served on Mayor Bass's transition, I was asked to kind of lift up a couple of things that she's been working on. But I think we'll be talking more in the panel about some initiatives that more generally in LA County we've been working on to really try and lift up best practices and provide better, more accountable services to everyone in LA County. So specifically, Mayor Bass has been working on an Inside Safe initiative in combination with, on day one, she declared an emergency on the homeless and housing crisis. And because of that declaration of emergency, was able to put in place things like her first executive directive, which is called ED1. And that directive speeds up the permitting for new affordable housing from, what used to take 6 months to a year to try and permit can now be permitted in less than 40 days. And with that measure, we've been able to permit in the last 18 months, over 20,000 new affordable units. Now, not all of those units are now in construction, and that's why we need Measure A. That's why we need, Prop 1 dollars. We need other initiatives to really fund and direct support for new affordable housing. The lack of access to financing to actually begin construction is a real issue because of high interest rates. But in terms of trying to address and cut red tape, and create really a whole of government response, and better relationships with LA County, and stronger ties with the state and the federal government, we've been able to implement a series of waivers. So things that are waiving, documentation requirements until after you're placed into housing, things that are waiving, requirements that really held back the housing of veterans. So there's been a lot of advocacy in the last couple of years where we think we've been able to kind of set the groundwork for some real progress moving forward in order to really address the housing crisis, but also to bring more people inside quickly. So I think that's kind of a general overview. In case you're new to this issue and just wanted to know more about kind of where we are, I would go to LAHSA's website. So LAHSA is the Los Angeles Housing Service Authority for LA County. That's lahsa.org. And on that website, you'll see the point in time count, which is a once a year count of people experiencing homelessness. And it'll show sort of where we are at this point in time and the fact that we have made progress in the last year for the first time ever. The count, not ever, but in the last 10 years, the count actually went down. The unsheltered population went down by 5%. We were able to increase the sheltered population. 5% countywide, and in the city of Los Angeles, 10%. So there's a really effective breakdown on those documents that you can find on that website. And I would just highly recommend checking it out because it's probably too much numbers and sort of information to throw at folks at once.
Yeah.
So with that, go ahead.
Sarah, I just wanted to jump in and just pause for a second. It is so remarkable that we have reversed the trend, that we can, that is not a small feat. It's always hard when we are still seeing so many people suffering to feel that progress, but I just wanted to highlight that. And I also wanted to mention, we're putting links that you've mentioned into the chat so folks can do a deeper dive. And when we do Q&A, we can, zero in on Measure A, but that was really helpful because it is such an important measure on the ballot.
Awesome. So with that, I think it's time to introduce our panelists and kind of start the Q&A. So I'd love to bring on the screen Shantae Armstrong, Sage Johnson, and Alex Vysotsky. And I've known Alex a long time, so it's fun to get to see him again because he used to work at the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. So with that, I think you're all on camera. I'd love it if you could each take just a minute to introduce yourselves, and then we could jump into Q&A.
Should I go first?
Yes, sorry, I muted myself too fast. Shantae, would you like to start?
Yeah, I was trying to read your lips there, Sarah.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shantae Armstrong. I am a graduate of Cal State LA and worked on the report No Going Back, Together for an Equitable and Inclusive Los Angeles. And I currently work for KidSave, a small nonprofit that serves older foster youth. And I lead a program called Embrace. And that purpose is to improve outcomes for Black youth in foster care. I've also worked at United Ways of California, and I've worked as a caseworker and directly with Black and Brown populations for about 20 years in the Bay Area, Los Angeles, and New York City. So I'll just say that one of the things that brought me to working on the report is that I'm originally from New York, and I remember flying into LA 7 years ago, and thinking, you know what, homelessness is one of the biggest, if not the biggest issue here. And I hadn't gotten my master's yet. And I was like, I'm going to work on this. Like, this is one thing. If there's nothing else I do, it's working on solving some of these problems. And so luckily I was able to, get a fellowship with PBI and have the opportunity. So, I'm happy to be here and offer some of my, what they say, expertise, here, and happy to be with you all as well.
Thank you so much. Obviously, we're lucky to have you. Alex, you want to jump in?
Sure. Thanks so much, Sarah. Really great to be with everybody today with this esteemed panel of folks. My name is Alex Visotsky. I am the Senior California Policy Fellow for National Alliance to End Homelessness. We are a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that advocates for the policy changes and the funding that we need to end homelessness, as it says in our name. And I lead up our California operations. So I spend a lot of time around the state and up in the state capitol trying to push for the resources we need to end homelessness. When I come to this work, I've done work in government, I've done work outside of government. I got my start in the housing world at the East LA Community Corporation in Boyle Heights over a dozen years ago, working on affordable housing development. So great to be here with the rest of these folks.
Awesome. Thank you. And Sage, could you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Sarah. Hey, everyone. My name is Sage, and I'm a Los Angeles native, born and raised here. I have both a personal and professional investment in ending homelessness here locally and across the country, but primarily here in my city and my county, because growing up here, I had a single mother. It was just her and I. And unfortunately, after the economic crash of 2008, we just never financially recovered, which kind of that with some personal issues in the household led to my homelessness, which led to my mother's homelessness. And because of that, how I had to navigate the different systems, how I had to be innovative as someone receiving services in the homeless system, and also someone later turned caseworker to also help other young adults in the homeless system. For me, it's work that I'm very passionate about. I've been doing it since 2015, coming up on my 10 years, my full decade of being engulfed in this work. And although I feel like I'm tired of repeating the same things, which I feel are common sense, it's still great to see some of the things that were spoken about years prior now coming to fruition. And we have way more hands on board and stakeholders who are willing to listen to people with expertise. Thank you.
Thank you. Sage, I'm actually going to start with you. I'd love it if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about your personal journey. Obviously, 10 years as an advocate and your own personal experience, we have a lot to learn from you. So if you wanted to elaborate on that, we would love it.
Awesome. So yes, I spent some time as my teens couch surfing. I need to stop saying but I spent some of my teen years couch surfing. Things at home were not that great. I had a mother who was disabled, and because she was disabled, I had to take on the caregiver role. And so for me, that was just a lot of things to handle. You have the teenage years, you have high school, you have friends, and then to take care of a mother who was going through not only physical body just not really where it used to be, also her mentality as well and her emotions, she was working through that, and we just kept clashing. So after spending all those years couch surfing, I think it's about 2 or 3 years I spent couch surfing, more towards 3, then I actually entered into the homeless system during an emergency overnight call, and that was my first. That single overnight bed situation at one of the local shelters here in Hollywood for me was a turning point of, do I want to continue on with what I had going on at home and after some years hopefully it gets better, or do I want to just be like, hey, give it to God and go into a program? So I gave it to God. I found a program that was for young people, young queer adults. For me, that was with the Los Angeles LGBT Center. And I was with them for continuously 3 years through their housing programs. I have experience with staying in the overnight emergency shelters, which were 14-day to 30-day shelters. I have experience with the Department of Mental Health funded beds for young adults. At that time, it was 36 days, but through constant feedback and input from young adults who went through those programs, they now extended it to 90 days, which is great. Because how can you really find somewhere stable after 36 days? This was like back in 2015. So the fact that they took our feedback and extended it to 90 days as a present date is wonderful. I then transitioned into an 18-month program, which was kind of like a college dormitory setup, which was great for me. I got my GED because I did drop out of high school because I was taking care of my mother. I did receive my GED. I was part-time employed, and my advocacy really kicked in for myself once my mother became evicted, which was just 3 months after I left home for good. I guess I was that last pillar of stability, unfortunately. So once she entered into homelessness, I just want the system to kind of do what it's going to do for me. I'll just listen to y'all program. I can't tell nobody what to do here. You are the case manager. Please manage my case. But once my mother was homeless, we didn't have family to lean back on. Then that's when I really had to actually learn the in and outs of the system. What are the policies? What are the programs? Yes, as a young adult, I'm a single young adult. I can't bring on an elderly older woman. So now I need to learn the adult homeless system, which is different. And then the medical system because she was disabled. So for me, I had to be really creative and really just ask so many people, so many programs, what can I do for my mom? How can I also help other young adults get out of this situation as well? Because during my time in the emergency shelter and navigating those homeless programs, I saw a lot of young people who were chronically unhoused. And I mean, they were 1 year, 2 year, 3 years and up. And the young adult system is only 6 years. You're 18 to 24 years old before you transition to the adult program. So I was just kind of doing it all, but really my mom was my main goal. If I got her back housed, maybe I can go back live with her, cut my homelessness time short, maybe kumbaya at the end of the day. But that's not how things worked out. And I've been an advocate ever since.
Wow. Well, you're incredibly brave and resilient, and we're so honored to be here with you. So
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. I am gonna jump to Shantae and talk a little bit about working on the PBI housing report and what are the key takeaways that you want to lift up here today.
Yeah, sure. For me, there were a few things. One is I'll say that homelessness, racism, and equity all go hand in hand. I know that's a key thing for, PBI, but for me, it's always where I'm coming from, right? How can we lift up the voices of the people, Black and brown folks, marginalized community, LGBT, and you see a lot of high rates of people from the queer community and transgender community homeless as well. And so how can we really focus on lifting those voices up and looking at it from an equity standpoint? And that's part of how we can solve the homeless issue here in Los Angeles. Secondly, is that governance in LA County can be very disjointed. And so that's a huge issue when we're thinking about how to solve the homeless crisis, because how can we have, 87 cities working together to solve a crisis that affects everybody in some overlapping ways, in some different ways, and everybody wants a little piece, right? Everybody wants to change something in their own way. And so it can be challenging you really need a governance structure that's going to blanket in some ways and compromise for all the different cities, and people are going to have to compromise. Like that's just part of what's going to have to happen in order to find solutions and be practical and effective in the medium and the long term. Because I think some of what you mentioned earlier, Sarah, in your introduction is like those solutions that have been enacted are amazing, and I love it, and I love to see it. But how can we have that in the medium and the long term as well? Because we still see a lot of people who are out on the streets, right?
Yeah.
And lastly, I would say what came up a lot in our conversations, and I was an intern right back then, giving my 2 cents, was NIMBYism. And so for those maybe who don't know what that is not in my backyard, right? And so that kind of goes back to equity as well, but it's from a different perspective. So when you're reading the report and noticing the 2 different pathways, I would say, one pathway that I mentioned earlier, which is lifting up the voices of the people and the needs and meeting those needs and finding solutions. And the other is folks who have who are in a space to provide actual housing or to open their communities to housing are don't want necessarily low income folks in their communities. And so having those conversations around like, well, what can that look like where we can find a solution for both the people that are already placed in communities where they have where they don't want homeless populations there. What can they compromise so that we can all do our little bit together so that everybody can have a place to live. I would say that, oh, and my fourth one would be how can we make change in the policy world, right? Like, and that's what I would take from No Going Back, is making real change in policy, medium and long term as well, and connecting that with equitable based outcomes. So those are my 4 takeaways.
That's great. Thank you for lifting those up. I'm gonna go to Alex and talk. Alex, if you could talk a little bit, because your perspective, you have a statewide perspective. It'd be great to hear, because I'm very narrowly focused on Los Angeles, and my experience is LA. And that might be true for most of us on the webinar. So a little bit of comparison of how Los Angeles is faring, across versus, other cities. What are they experiencing across the state?
Yeah.
Sort of what do you want to lift up in terms of that comparison?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot that's unique about Los Angeles, but before talking about that, our crisis has a lot in common with the rest of the state and really now the rest of the country, which is a housing crisis that results in a homeless crisis that, has largely stemmed from this incredibly competitive housing market that has been made much more competitive by, massive cuts over the last few decades to housing and homelessness investments at the federal level, really during the 1970s and the 1980s, which also coincided to cuts to all sorts of other social services like mental health services, like substance use disorder services. And then we saw big cuts at the state level in the wake of the Great Recession. And then, as Shantae mentioned, segregation, right, and zoning that has allowed lots of communities, primarily, more affluent, whiter communities, to keep affordable housing out of their neighborhoods, right? Those factors have created a housing and homelessness crisis around our state. I think the other thing I want to mention is, in LA, we talk a lot about how do we fix our system? How do we make our system better at responding to homelessness, which is a really important conversation. But we should also keep it front and center that, it's the housing market, it's decades of institutional racism, and these big picture factors that drive people into homelessness. We need to fix the system, but we can't blame the system for creating the problem, right? It's a bit like looking at the emergency room. You want an emergency room at the hospital that's effective, that moves people quickly, that gets them connected to the care they need as quickly as possible. But you don't blame the emergency room for people showing up with medical emergencies, right? So that's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind. So what does make LA unique, though? We've had really significant local investment here in the last few years from, Measure H, as Sarah mentioned, as well as HHH at the city level to build new supportive housing. City of LA, just in their budget alone in recent years, has put up $1 billion of its budget. That's about 10% of its budget to addressing homelessness. If you compare that to other cities like, San Diego, that's about double what they're doing on a per capita basis. So the city and the county, again, there's problems to address here, but really are putting a lot of energy and money behind the issue. As Shantae mentioned, LA has a really Byzantine political system compared to the rest of the state and the rest of the country. We've got 88 cities around the county. We have this massive entity in the county. We have, even within cities, like within our city of Los Angeles, we have a complex system where we have 15 different city council offices that, control land use and zoning, and more are controlling parts of the homelessness response within their jurisdiction. So that is somewhat unique in terms of that complexity. But I think our response to that has also been unique. LA seems to finally be tackling this head on through the creation of an executive committee on regional homeless alignment that kind of emerged out of this report that Shantae mentioned, and out of this Blue Ribbon Commission that Sarah, that you played a major role in. And that committee is bringing together folks from the county like Supervisor Barger and Horvath. It's bringing together Mayor Bass, as well as council members from both Los Angeles and some of the other cities, to really start to break through these silos and break through all of these political barriers and these boundaries between our cities. And so I think that's a really important and unique step forward that LA is taking. The last thing I want to mention that I think has been unique to LA is we're seeing leadership at both the city and county say no to criminalizing homelessness. We've had folks like Mayor Bass and Supervisor Horvath being really honest with the public and saying, guess what? Shuffling people around, arresting them, ticketing them for the act of being homeless, that's not a strategy to end homelessness. In fact, it actually makes it harder. Unfortunately, looking around the state, that's becoming more and more unique of a response, but it's a really important one to keep in mind.
Thank you. That was really helpful. So for the next few minutes, I'd love to talk to each of you a little bit about a sort of what innovation are you invested in? Are you feel it like is working? And then what barriers are really sort of top of mind today? And I'll go back and start with Sage. I mean, for me, it's like all that matters is that, Sage, when you were experiencing what you were experiencing, that you could easily access the help that you needed and what you needed for your mom. I know you said that, there's been a lot of challenges, but have you noticed some improvements or some innovations in your advocacy work that you, from your own personal journey, that you want to lift up?
Yes, I would like to say, as someone with lived experience of homelessness and navigating primarily the homeless system and supportive services, that includes mental health services, access to Medi-Cal insurance, access to CalFresh food stamps, access to different sort of supportive services that will stabilize me post-housing. I will say in my collective years, I have seen a strengthening of the mainstream systems working in better collaboration and tandem with one another. When I first came in almost a decade ago, they were working very siloed. So an individual who is in need of resources, they typically have to go to one organization and say, this is my issue. This is what I'm coming to you with. Can you help me? They say, possibly not. You need to go to the next organization. The second organization said, we can't even help you before you actually do an intake at the first organization. And then the first organization sends a referral over to then we can take you on as a part of our caseload. So what we're seeing is that has been minimizing over the years because people who are directly impacted with having to go from resource to resource, organization to agency, back and forth, they took our input and they said, okay, let's see how we can simplify this process. Let's see, is there a channel way where we can send referrals en masse? So that way it's able to be taken in and people could just have less of a runaround. Now it still happens, but it's not as it's not as much as it was back then. So I would say it's one of the biggest things. And also, as someone with lived experience, I always said, take the input and feedback from someone who is actively going through the homeless system because they are a direct result of the policies, procedures, the rules, everything that's being enacted and given upon to the people receiving services. So if you want service recipients to better integrate into your programs, please take the input from the service recipients to better those programs for them to be willing to go in there and then go through the program and better on their own lives afterwards.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, simplification, it sounds like is really key in breaking down silos.
Yes.
Shantae, do you want to touch on some innovations that you've seen and also some barriers? I mean, you've lifted up sort of your key points from your report, but was there more you wanted to highlight?
I would say that, having governance goals to work together towards is a way to reduce barriers, and creating affordability I mean, it goes back to kind of that there's multiple complex structures happening at the same time. But affordability and for people that are experiencing homelessness, as well as for people that can, sorry, I got distracted, that can just, you know what, actually, I do want to lift up that there are other cities, I think, that are addressing homelessness in other ways, and have reduced homelessness. And it goes back to like, one, I think creating shelters for folks that they can go to, and creating programming and resources during to that are innovative and not temporary, right? So that we're not just taking people from the street and putting them in and taking them out of their communities, that are sometimes people choosing to be in, right? And they sometimes homelessness communities are actually can be very supportive in some ways. And so when you take those communities apart and you take people and put them in temporary housing, you can actually create more barriers for them by taking away their support system. And so how do we recognize that those communities exist and keep that community together while creating housing that isn't just going to fall apart, such as hotel housing. So yeah, those are some of the
That's
innovative
important
ways.
to lift up. I appreciate that. Alex, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of, is there one innovation that's really standing out for you right now? And also maybe, and then address on the barrier message. I like keeping these things together. So it's not, we're not just about the depressing, but we're also lifting up, what's working.
Yeah, I think even in California, where we have these like brutally competitive, difficult housing markets, there's exciting stuff happening even in some places like Santa Cruz and Monterey, where they're making really great progress. They've driven down homelessness, and there's a few things that I think are consistent with those approaches that they've taken. One is investing in building affordable housing is just, that's an essential ingredient, right? You're not laying the foundation for reducing homelessness if you're not actually building housing that's affordable to folks with low incomes. The other piece, though, is recognizing that building housing takes time, and investing in things like rental subsidies that pay a portion of your rent. So you only pay, a third of your rent, but a public agency makes up the rest. That's a really important way to get folks housed now without having to wait for this new housing to be built. And it's also oftentimes, a fairly cost-effective way to get folks into housing and their business. And, not particularly, I would say, innovative, but it feels like these are the things that we know work. It's a matter of resourcing them at the scale and focusing our resources on those things that work. The other thing is, I come back to it as a barrier is criminalization of homelessness and seeing that as a strategy, right? Ticketing, arresting, finding people. Right now, we've just seen the city of Fresno, for example, pass a ban on homelessness that is going to have folks, subject potentially to 6 months jail time or $1,000 fine for experiencing homelessness. What happens after the fact, right? You've got somebody now with a record, more barriers to getting back into housing, more financial barriers to getting back into housing, right? Doing those things adds time to actually ending homelessness. Criminalizing is kicking the can down the road and making it such that, it's going to take us longer to actually solve the problem. Not to mention, we're talking about kind of doubling down on some of the racist policies of the past and doubling down on these kind of tough crime narratives that I think have helped create this problem to some extent. So I don't have like particularly exciting, innovative things. I think it's like we know what works. It's just a matter of kind of getting the governance right, getting the leadership right to actually focus on it.
Great, thank you. Shantae, you went off mute. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, also addressing the barrier of mental health in homelessness, right, as well. Like, how do we, I don't know, and I also will say that I don't have an innovation there, but mental health is such a huge issue. And I think it not only affects the people who are experiencing homelessness, but also those around them, right? And the communities around them. And so finding resources to finding resources where people feel comfortable and safe accessing those resources, and meeting people where they're at, right? Even if there are clinicians or people with even just some experience involved in people with lived experience, to go physically, to go to the street and talk to people and see what the real issues are, and then come back and make policy change and mental health resources around that, because mental health rates are very, very high for people who are homeless and who are experiencing homelessness, and it can lead also to criminalization as well. So prevention of that can be really helpful.
Yeah, I didn't share with this group, but I'm open about it, and you're welcome to Google me. I've worked with trying to house my brother, who's severely mentally ill, and has been on the streets on and off of Los Angeles for about 20 years. And because of that, he had an arrest record longer than his arm, and that's made it very difficult to find permanent housing. But I will lift up in this section of innovation that right now he is housed. He's at a boarding care, and he is participating in the brand new clubhouse, which is a peer-run clubhouse in Hollywood that is part of advocacy efforts for a lot of us in Los Angeles for many years. And just it's so neat for him to be able to have that resource, because certainly in the past, we would drive around looking for anything like that and found nothing for many, many years. So that's been an exciting innovation that's been put into place. Well, I would love to talk briefly, because I know we have some questions and I want to get to them. If folks could, I'm just going to go through each one of you. How can people get more involved? What's your best recommendation in terms of either advocacy or engagement, or participate in the homeless count, whatever it might be, that you think is a good entryway for? We have about 150 participants on this webinar. So how do we help folks get more engaged and be part of the solutions? So Sage, do you want to start on that?
Yes, so I have a couple ways. One is for those in LA County, you can sign up at LASA.org to participate in the annual homeless count. They typically send out a newsletter every December, January, before the count takes place at the end of January, for volunteers if you like to go out with agencies, organizations, LASA staff themselves, to go out and physically count our unhoused neighbors on the street. And this is a great way for people to actually see how we get the numbers that we get every year that are released annually. Like, you actually get to be a part of, what does that stat look like? What does that look like for us to go out to the point of time count? What does that look like for the youth count, where we have to go and make rapport with people, speak to them, remind ourselves that they are our neighbor. They just don't have a physical address, and the sidewalk is not an address. So we need to do our part in making sure that everyone can eventually have an address. Secondly, participating in city council meetings when new developments are being brought up, and voting for affordable housing to be in your neighborhood. I do understand that affordable housing is a dirty word for people. They tend to think about the stigma of Section 8. There's that fear of low-income renters, without actually taking into account the people who will be housed in these units. Not only people who have experienced homelessness, but people who also work in that neighborhood, who may not just be able to afford living in that neighborhood. Recently, a development was coming up here in West Hollywood, towards the more western side of West Hollywood, and there were a lot of neighbors who were voting no on the new development, but the city and the advocates were saying, this will house the people who work up in the hotels up the street. This will house the people who are working at the bars, who don't necessarily have the wage itself to live here without the assistance, but very much still contribute to the community at hand. So I would like to break the stigma that affordable housing is, oh, they're going to bring down our property taxes. No, we want people to be housed so then people can contribute with their taxes to better the community. I think people's fear should be noted, but not necessarily fed into. And I lovingly love to just have these conversations with folks who are open to listening, because housing is a right, and we as a society can advance society if we allow these simplistic apartments to be built. Thank you.
Can I follow up on that real quick? Because we have a little bit of time. What does it mean for housing to be a human right? I mean, that is the topic of our webinar to you, Sage, because I do think it's strange sometimes when people object to new housing. If housing is a human right, how can we object? Like if it's a basic service, if it's like water, if it's roads, how does that work? Where is that tension?
I think especially here in Los Angeles, we think of housing as more so of a privilege, especially you want the privilege of living where we are a huge entertainment industry here in Los Angeles. Forgive me for the sirens in the background, but here in Los Angeles,
No, we can't hear them. Your computer is amazing. Don't
perfect.
worry.
Thank you, Lenovo. So here in Los Angeles, we tend to think that the entertainment industry, you have Hollywood, you have West Hollywood, you have Silver Lake, you have Santa Monica, you have things where people strive to be, if they quote unquote making it, without actually taking into account that everyone deserves an apartment where they don't have to pay more than $1,600 for a studio apartment, which is absurd no matter where you live within the city or the county. And to better encapsulate what I want to say, I have a direct quote. To quote the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights at the United Nations, increasingly viewed as a commodity, housing is most importantly a human right. Under international law, to be adequately housed means having secure tenure, not having to worry about being evicted or having your home or lands taken away. It means living somewhere that is keeping in with your culture and having access to appropriate services, schools, and employment. And
Wow.
affordable housing makes it so people can at least reach that baseline of housing being a human right. Now,
Yeah.
where you want to live after that, you can strive to somewhere else. But baseline access to apartments, to single family homes, being able to be a first-time home buyer is great. But let's not keep kicking the goalposts down to make it seem as housing is like that last thing that we can grab ever in life.
Awesome. And we'll make sure to put in the chat that, lacity.org and the county website, just so that people could track where these meetings are happening, where they can share, the message that you're sharing with us today, Sage. So Shantae, how do you recommend folks get more involved in addressing this crisis?
I mean, one, I would say read the report and vote, right? We talked about some measures to vote on. And so do some research, and there's ways that you can look it up and see like what's the synopsis about it and make a choice. Voting is really important because policy makes big changes. Even though sometimes policy can take a long time to enact, it still does create change in the long run. I would say, volunteer. If you feel comfortable, you can volunteer. I mean, this is not necessarily innovative, but my mother, she lives in New York, and we don't have necessarily, I've never been homeless, but I grew up in poverty, and my father passed away from AIDS when I was 19. He was a heroin addict, and we were on food stamps and all that stuff growing up. And I think, knowing that there's community around you is really, really important when you're going through hard times, and being able to go, get some food at a shelter and seeing friendly faces who've done their research, right? Who are informed on how to interact in a culturally responsive way as well, can just change your mindset just a little bit, so that it makes it easier to live to the next day. And so, I was just thinking about my mother. She volunteers now, right? She's like older, and she's had a hard life, and now she's still volunteering to give back. So I would say, and don't just volunteer during the holidays, right? Like do it when nobody else is doing it. And on another note, I work for a nonprofit that serves older foster youth, and many times being in the foster care system can lead to homelessness, especially without permanent connections. So, and we have a lot of resources on our website around how to be preventive in terms of, people living on the streets and experiencing homelessness. So even working with foster youth can be really helpful, or working in a way to prevent it in any form. So a lot of these structures are often they may seem disjointed, but there are funnels, right? There's often funnels for Black and brown folks who don't get what they need, and so having that community support can lead to prevention in the long run.
Awesome. I think that's so helpful. Alex, how would you suggest people get more or better involved? And then I also want to couple onto that, because Shante brought up the ballot. If there are any other ballot measures that you wanted to lift up, just in order to encourage people to be informed, feel free.
Yeah. We have like poll after poll after poll tells us the same thing, which is that most people are with us on housing and homelessness, right? They want to see stronger action. I think what often happens though is there's not everybody is as activated as maybe the NIMBYs or the folks advocating for criminalization, right? Those are the folks calling their city council offices every day, getting in their ear. And so we oftentimes have a disconnect, I think, between what the public on the whole wants to see and the actions sometimes that policymakers take. So for me, it's not always about convincing people what's right. It's how do we activate the people who are with us. So I would say that the Yes on Measure A campaign is a great way over the next couple weeks to get involved, not just to help get Measure A passed, but as a way to get connected to those organizations that are doing the work and fighting these policy fights in neighborhoods, in the community every day. So I just dropped a link for Yes on A. Great way to like go hit up a phone bank, hit up a walk on a Saturday morning. That's like a great way to meet a lot of folks, get connected to the organizations that are advocating for more affordable housing, that are advocating for the resources for folks experiencing homelessness. I'll mention a couple state ballot measures while we're at it. Prop 33, right, is one that I know a lot of folks have asked me about. This is one that just does not enact rent control, but it gives cities more flexibility to enact rent control if they choose to. I also want to highlight Prop 36. Prop 36 is, and my organization has taken a no on Prop 36 position. Prop 36 rolls back some of the criminal justice reforms from a decade ago that lowered some of the penalties for really petty crimes and made a bunch of things that were felonies into misdemeanors. This would roll that and basically take it, kind of go back to like a war on drugs approach that I think a lot of our communities have seen as a failure, and has helped create some of the racist outcomes in homelessness, some of the racist outcomes in the criminal justice system. So those are a couple things to pay attention to on your ballot. But yeah, I would just say primarily, I think Yes on A is a great way to really hook in with some of these organizations doing work that need all the people they can to be with them and to be making phone calls to their city council offices every day.
Well, and let me just add in to stay engaged for the long term, as you mentioned. That is really helpful. And as both Shante and Sage mentioned, when all the no's show up, then it's pretty easy to feel like that's the loudest voice in the community. But really, there are a whole lot of yeses out there. And I would just add the other thing that I think folks should feel empowered to do is to ask why. Like, why are so many people experiencing homelessness? Why, is it so hard to get help for somebody's mom? Why of this? it can be annoying. Government doesn't always love to be asked why all the time, but it's really important that we question where we are right now, because there was a time before the massive cuts that Alex was describing, where in general, homelessness was a pretty rare occurrence, because we had sufficient housing supply, and we had a social safety net, and we had access to, mental health care. So it's so important that, everyone on this webinar feels empowered to ask why, and does, do your research, and certainly be a part of the solution. All of us here really welcome you in that. And with that, I think we can give people 2 minutes back of their day, or I'm going to hand it back to Sasha.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah and Shantae and Sage and Alex. If we were in a room, I would say give a round of applause, and just so appreciate your thoughts. I wanted to just circle back to something Sage shared, the quote that you shared. And I'd love it if you could email that to me, and I can share it out in a post communication from the chat, from the webinar, because I think that, we didn't dig into this idea, but I think, like water and roads and, quality air, we should be able to have a spot. And it's become really made super complex, and the ballot measures can be a spotlight on that. And before we closed, I just wanted to circle back to Prop 33 again, because I think that highlights how policy does make changes, because if I'm not mistaken, I think that's changing the Costa-Hawkins Act. And maybe Alex, I'll throw that to you to give us a little more background on 33.
Yeah, sure. So in the late 70s, essentially the California state legislature made a change that restricted the extent to which local cities could put on rent caps. This was called the Costa-Hawkins Act. And it has essentially meant that there's only a chunk of the housing stock in each city where the city council or the county board can enact ordinances that can control the growth of rent. So essentially what it's meant is, rent control is a pretty limited tool in the toolbox. What Prop 33 and what some recent state laws have sought to do is really start to chip away at that and try to expand the amount of housing that can be covered by rent control should a local city choose to take action there. So for example, right now, rental housing that's inside of a single family home, which is a huge portion of the rental stock here in Los Angeles, is prohibited from being covered by rent control. If Prop 33 were to pass, that could change, and cities would have the ability, the flexibility to start covering those with rent control.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a lot to absorb, but I think it's just an example of how, policy does really impact our lives. And just another commercial for voting. You still have time to register, and we might have some first-time voters on this call. I just wanted to remind everybody that you don't have to fill out the entire ballot. If you're confused about a measure, or if, these judges or anything like that, you don't have to vote on every single piece of your ballot. It's not a test. And there's amazing voter guides that are out there. We are happy to share them in the chat. Cal Matters has one, LAist has one, League of Women Voters is really great for a nonpartisan breakdown. And I wanted to just remind folks that, the law works when we make it work for us. And so jump in and make your voice heard. We are going to be, our next event in our Civic Series is going to be Voter Fest, which is next week on Tuesday, and we'll be on campus from 10 to 2. We're going to have some smash burgers free for the first 100 people who are there. And also going to have some great art activations, and we'll also be screening the top 10 finalists for our PSA Get Out the Vote, Participate in Democracy Challenge. So lots of good stuff happening. Again, I just want to thank our panel and our moderator. We really appreciate you making time for this, and we're just so delighted you could be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Have a great day. Thanks for joining, everybody.